بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Dear brothers, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I would like to welcome you all to RT Knowledge Sharing event. RT is glad today to have Professor Habib Ahmed to present his lecture. The title of the presentation is Knowledge, Economy and Islamic Finance, a New Institutional Economic Perspective. Before we start, let me briefly introduce Dr. Habib. Professor Habib Ahmed, Chartered Chair in Islamic Law and Finance at Durham University Business School, UK. Before that, he was a manager, research and development Islamic Banking Development Group, National Commercial Bank, NCB of Saudi Arabia. He had also worked at Islamic Research and Training Institute, RT, and taught at the University of Connecticut, USA, National University of Singapore, and University of Bahrain. Professor Habib has a PhD in economics from University of Connecticut, United States, and 2 master degree, one from University of Chittagong, Bangladesh, and the other one from University of Oslo, Norway. He has been a member of the Working Group of Islamic Financial Service Board, IFSB. Professor Habib will present for about maybe 40 minutes? 45 minutes. 45 minutes. After that, we will have question and answer session. Now, I would like to invite Professor Habib to deliver his presentation.
Thank you very much. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. It's a pleasure to be back at IDB. As mentioned, I was here for almost 8 years before I moved to UK. And I thank ITI for organizing this lecture. The lecture will be on Knowledge, Economy and Islamic Finance, a New Institutional Economics Perspective. In this lecture, I plan to cover the following things. First, I'll try to establish the role of knowledge in an economy, looking at it from a new institutional economics perspective. And then, given that knowledge plays a very important part in the economy from a new institutional economics perspective, I'll give you some data on the status of knowledge in Muslim Arab world, mainly the Arab world, because these are data taken from international organizations like United Nations and the World Bank. And then I try to look at the implications of this framework, new institutional economic framework for Islamic finance, and conclude with how we move forward, and then conclude my talk. If you look at economics literature, they approach knowledge in different ways. In neoclassical economics, usually knowledge is discussed in growth theories. In the classical Solo model, you have growth in an economy related to capital and labor, and the assumption is that both labor and capital, there's embedded knowledge. So you're talking about human capital, and capital itself is a result of knowledge. In new growth theory, which was proposed by Romer and Lucas, for example, they actually explicitly talk about knowledge and say that knowledge and technology are very important determinants of economic growth. Now, this is the neoclassical kind of approach, looking at it from a production function point of view. The new institutional economics economists, they criticize this approach to be very narrow, and they say that it fails to actually, in some ways, explain the differences in different economies, and also it fails to explain the evolution of economies. So you may have two countries with the same resources. One country will evolve in a different way than another, and they say that if you look at the neoclassical growth rate, it cannot explain this. So they look at the economy at a much deeper and a comprehensive way. They look at society at 4 different levels. It starts with culture, and then they look at institutions, organizations, and they also talk about the market and transactions. Now, because these are the building blocks of the new institutional economics, I'm going to go over each of these in the following slides. When it comes to culture, the culture is a social phenomena and as such is defined in different ways. I have picked up 3 definitions here. The first is by Hofstede and Hofstede. They're actually husband and wife who wrote a very important book on culture. And according to them, culture is patterns of thinking, feeling, and acting, basically the software of the mind. So this definition of culture is very micro level. They're talking about individuals, and how people behave, the software of the mind, is basically determined by the culture of the people. The second definition is the means by which people communicate, perpetuate, and develop knowledge about attitude towards life. The interesting thing about this definition of knowledge is, the definition of culture is that they have incorporated knowledge in this definition. And I think this is important because, as you will see, the new institutional economics, they consider knowledge to be a very important part of culture, which is responsible for evolution of different economies. Finally, the definition of culture is taken from Arab Human Development Report 2003. They define culture as all human contributions to ideas, perceptions, customs, socio-political systems, and economic constructs. Actually, this definition, as you see, is much broader. And in new institutional economics, this is the kind of definition they use. What they say is that culture is not only what people do and think, but also it creates the socio-political systems and economic constructs. Now, when we look at culture, we can look at it in 3 different levels. One is the core, which relates to the beliefs and assumptions of human existence, mainly the ontology. For example, if you have societies which do not believe in God, their behavior, culture will be very different than societies which believe in God. So it is the core issues about what people believe in terms of human existence. From that, we come to the second layer. The values and norms formed by people in terms of culture will depend on this core. What are their beliefs in terms of the basic existence of humans? And then finally, we have the explicit culture, which relates to the outward experiences. And for example, this will be art, culture, the way people dress, what they eat. These will be the explicit expressions of culture. Institutions are defined in a much broader way. Actually, this is not when we talk about institutions in new institutional economics framework, it relates to the overall environment in which a society operates. So it relates to the state, the constitution, the laws, the justice system. So when we talk about institution, we're basically talking about issues like the judiciary, the legislature, the courts, the police system, the bureaucracy. All of these are the institutions which a country has. So we're not talking about institutions in terms of organizations, but institutions in terms of the overall legal regulatory framework under which a society operates. The institutions, according to the new institutional economics perspective, determines the human and political rights of citizens, and also it determines the rule of law, whether it exists or not. In terms of economics, institutions are important because institutions defines the property rights and the rules of exchange. So, for example, the law of property would define what are the property rights accepted, and what are the rules, the laws of contract will define what are the accepted rules of exchange. Then at the third level, we have organizations which can be defined as groups of individuals who come together for achieving a common purpose. In economics, usually we think of firms, but organizations can be many different things. For example, non-profits, for example, Waqf would be an under organization, and also includes institutions like schools, universities, unions, for example. All of these are groups of people who come together to achieve a certain goal. The issues which are important under organizations are the structure, the format of the organization, and how the organization is governed. And in economics, the issues discussed are related to transaction costs, risks, how to manage risks within an organization. Finally, we have the last level of analysis, which relates to markets and transactions. In new institutional economics, this can be viewed in two ways. One is the traditional neoclassical perspective, where we discuss the markets, we look at the demand issues, the supply issues, how they interact in the market, where exchange of goods, resources, and services takes place. Another way to look at it is to look at all the exchanges in the market in terms of nexus of contracts. What this is saying is that whenever an exchange takes place, there's an implicit or explicit contract. So if you go to a store and you buy, for example, a bread for 5 riyals, for example, there's an implicit contract that to take this bread, I must pay the 5 riyals, even though you don't sign a contract. But of course, we know that when transactions become more complex, we sign explicit contracts. Now, what is important in this issue is the technology used will determine the prices, what are the costs, what are the risks. All of these will determine the type of products and contracts that are used in the markets. So these are the 4 building blocks of the new institutional economics. And in the next slide, we can see how the new institutional economists, they look at evolution of economies. For them, the starting point is the culture. Just a clarification, if you look at these 4 building blocks, in culture, we are talking about humans and the people who represent this culture. Institutions, organizations, and transaction markets, these are human constructs. So culture is the starting point because that's where we're talking about individuals and humans who interact and create these other institutions. According to new institutional economics, culture entails the knowledge, and this knowledge determines what type of institutions society will have. So the laws of the country will depend on the culture. So if, for example, if you're talking about a society where Muslims are a majority, they would prefer institutions which represent their culture, Islamic law, legal systems. Now, once you have the institutions will determine what kind of organizations you'll have. So, for example, if you want to have a corporation, there must be a supporting corporate law. If you don't have the laws for certain organizations, you cannot establish the organizations legally in the society. So in a lot of Muslim countries, for example, there are no, of course in non-Muslim countries and some Muslim countries, there are no waqf laws. So legally in these countries, you cannot establish a waqf because there's no law supporting it. So what kind of organizations a society has will partly depend on the institutions, the institutional setup. The laws determine what type of organizations you can have. And finally, the organizations, some of them in economics, they would be producing goods and services to sell in the market. So the transactions has a demand side and a supply side. The organizations are the ones which supply the goods and services. Again, the culture is the one which shows the preferences in terms of what to buy and sell. So culture also reflects the consumption patterns, what is preferred in a society, and these are come together, the demand and supply side come together in a market, and that's where the transactions takes place. So the key issue in new institutional economics perspective is that knowledge is the key. The culture, it produces the knowledge, which produces not only the institutions, it also produces the organizations and also the products which are exchanged in the market. So if, for example, the production of knowledge stops, the institutions become stagnant, the organizations will become obsolete, and you'll come up with products which there is no knowledge content in these products. we'll discuss that in the next slide. The other way we can look at evolution or changes in economies is the marginal adaptation approach. In this, what happens is that the overall legal regulatory environment in the society remains intact, and organizations, they try to adapt their production given the new preferences which appear in the market. So you can have here in this marginal adaptation, the changes starts from the transactions level. So you may have a group of people who want some product, for example, Islamic finance. Muslims want financial products which are Sharia compliant. So the banks, they react by supplying this. But this is done without changing the overall institutional, the legal regulatory framework. Organizations would come and supply this, but the overall structure of the economy remains the same. You can also have changes coming from the organizations themselves. For example, Apple coming up with new products due to change in technology, and this again is demanded by the people. So you can have the new products coming in and exchange in the markets, but the key issue is in the marginal adaptation, the institutional framework does not change. All of these changes are marginal and takes place at the market level. To conclude, before we go to looking at the status of knowledge in Arab countries and Muslim countries, new institutional economy is basically, it says that knowledge is embedded in cultures, institutions, organizations, and products. And this is very true. I mean, for example, if you think of a mobile, if you look at it, it's basically plastic and metal. But it can be sold at so high a price because knowledge is embedded in it and it can perform certain functions. So according to new institutional economics, not only products, organizations also, the formats you have, they're also knowledge-based, and institutions, they change and evolve through input of new knowledge. So given this, what we can distinguish is that in intrinsic evolution, we have a culture of learning and innovation. New knowledge is reflected in institutions and organizations, and this society will produce and consume knowledge-based products and services. In countries where knowledge is not created, we have marginal adaptation. Cultures are slow to produce and use knowledge, stagnant institutions and organizations. And these economies will be mainly factor commodity-based economies and passively consume knowledge-based products. Now, before I go to talk about the status of knowledge, just some concepts of knowledge itself. It will help us understand how knowledge works in the economy. There's a distinction, actually this distinction is made by United Nations in one of their papers, knowledge wealth and knowledge capital. Knowledge wealth is basically the sum total of knowledge assets. For example, the literacy rates in different countries, how many engineers they have, how many doctors they have. Then they also talk about knowledge capital. This is part of the knowledge which is used to create new knowledge. So we're talking about research and development. And actually, if you look at the World Bank Knowledge Index, it uses education index, which will be knowledge wealth. And then it talks about innovation index, that will be the reflection of the knowledge capital. And the other issue is that creation of new knowledge, when we talk about knowledge capital, there is an effort needed. Usually what happens is we start with the raw data, you work on it, human effort, transform the data into information, and from information we create knowledge. And not all knowledge can be useful. So when you're talking about useful knowledge which helps the economy to grow and has a positive impact on the economy. And again, there's a distinction between explicit knowledge and tacit knowledge. A lot of knowledge which is produced is not applied in real life. It actually does not have any value, usefulness. So when you're talking about useful knowledge, we're talking about knowledge which is changed from explicit, the know what, into know how, so that we can come up with the products, the organizations, and the institutions. So this is also important from a new institutional economics perspective. Now, given this background, let's look at some very broad figures. But before I do that, just to give two quotes from two scholars. This quote is knowledge in the Muslim world in the past. We all know that the Islamic world had its golden age, and Islamic knowledge was at its zenith until 10th century and remained there until 15th century. Some actually would say the 13th century is when the decline started, 13th century being the century when the Mongols invaded Baghdad. But the key issue here is a quote here from Frank Rosenthal, who wrote a book on Islam and knowledge. And this is a quote from his book. There is no other concept that has been operative as a determinant of Muslim civilization in all its aspects to the same extent as ilm. Then he says ilm is Islam. So this was in some ways, the status of knowledge in the history of Islamic civilization. The second quote I have is from a recent scholar, Abdul Hamid Abu Suleiman, who was a rector of Islamic, he's Saudi, by the way, but he was rector of Islamic University of Malaysia. And this is his quote. He's in one of his writings, he's saying, the Muslim mind has lost its ability to give birth to new ideas, to update its institutions, and to produce the planning, means, and policies essential to further progress at the civilization level. So in some ways, this quote reflects the new institutional economics, that the Muslim mind has lost its ability to produce the ideas and knowledge to update its institutions and policies. Now let's look at some specific figures. As you see, this is from UNESCO, 2013. This is adult literacy rates, relatively new. I tried to look for new data, I couldn't find it. So we see that the Arab states have an average literacy rate which is lower than the developing countries, and female literacy rate is also lower than the average of developing countries. It is higher than the South and West Asian countries, and the sub-Saharan countries, but on the average, it's basically, when you look at the Latin American and East Asian countries, it is relatively low. This is another figure which looks at the, again, knowledge wealth, but here this is a projection of how many illiterate population 15 years and older. The ones in green means that the absolute number will decrease, and the ones in red means that the absolute number will increase. Now, of course, in terms of percentage, the numbers will go down because the population will increase. But even we see that only in case of sub-Saharan Africa and Arab countries, we see that the total number in absolute numbers, illiterate population will increase for both Arab countries and sub-Saharan African countries. This is taken from World Development Indicators report, which actually looks at the fulfillment of the Millennium Development Goals. This is the Millennium Development Goal number 3, which looks at gender disparities. The red and pink basically says that this target was off the target of the Millennium Development Goals. So this is related to secondary education within primary and secondary education between female and male. And we see that the Middle East, unfortunately, is showing that many countries were off target. Now, until now, we looked at the quantity. If you look at the quality, these are actually done by Boston University. We look at science and math skills of grade 8, just to give an idea of the quality of education. On the left, I have the Arab countries, and on the right are the top countries which scored the highest in this score. So we see Singapore, or the South Asian countries, are the ones which are ranked the highest. And if you look at on the left, we have the Arab countries. They are, as you see, in terms of the quality of math education in schools, it is relatively low. Finally, we have here figures for investment in knowledge creation. So the first column shows us the global research and development share. We see 1/3 of it is spent in North America, 1/3 in Europe, and almost 1/3 in Asia and rest of the world. Now, if you look at the Arab countries themselves, actually, I think the second column is more interesting. R&D expenditure as a percentage of GDP. The world average is 1.8% of GDP. Of course, not the key issue here is the Arab states in Africa and Arab states in Asia. You see, it's a very, very small percentage of the GDP spent in research and development. Interestingly, I've put Israel there. If you look at Israel's research and development as a percentage of GDP, it is the highest in the world, actually. And the last column shows us how many researchers per million inhabitants are there in these different regions. The world average is 1,000 plus researchers per million inhabitants. The numbers for Arab states in Africa is 415 and Arab states is only 119, which is actually lower than that of Africa. So we see that we actually are investing very, very little in terms of knowledge creation and research and development. And this is the number of patents in 20 years, to 1980 to 2000. Again, if you look at the number of patents in the countries I've listed is 370, compared to, if you look at South Korea as one country having 16,000 plus patents during these 20 years. A country like Chile has 147. And finally, this is your knowledge education index and knowledge index, knowledge economy index and knowledge index. Just to give an idea that the MENA region, you see, is lower than the world average. Depressing numbers. Now let's move on to how we can use this new institutional economics framework to explain what has happened in Islamic finance. When we talk about Islamic finance, I think we have to talk about it in some context. And the context is that it is a part of an Islamic economy. And when we talk about Islamic economics, it has a perspective, it has some background, and we have to remember that background. If you remember, the Islamic economics was officially launched in 1976. There were writers before that who had talked about it, but it was in 1976 through the first conference on International Conference in Islamic Economics that we say that it was officially launched. The Islamic economists who attended this conference, they basically said that Islamic economics can provide an alternative to socialism and capitalism. During the 1970s, of course, there was this tension between capitalism and socialism. In capitalism, we have growth, but the problem is that of equity, and we can see that more and more now with the distribution of income concentrated towards the upper 1%. And in socialism, what we had was you had equity, but the problem was growth because it was against the incentive structures of people. And what Islamic economists basically said that we have a system in Islam which, if used properly, would fulfill the Maqasid of Sharia and also give a balance between equity and growth. Now, actually what happened eventually was that Islamic economics ended up in the financial sector. So we had Islamic banking and finance, which were sub-economies within the economies. The whole economy was business as usual, and then within those we had Islamic banking. And as all of you know, Islamic banking is growing rapidly in terms of quantity, growing from 17 to 20% annually, even after the crisis. But there are questions about its quality. So in terms of quantity, it's growing fast, we accept that, but in terms of quality, whether it is achieving the objectives for which it was created. Now here we have some numbers from actually what do the stakeholders think about Islamic banking. Actually, this is one of our PhD students who did a survey of 477 Malaysians who are just common people. What do they expect about Islamic finance? As you see, the first two are legal issues, prohibition of riba, and provide Sharia compliant products. Majority of the respondents, they said that these are very important. And if you look at the last column, which is the mean, 5 means that it's very important. 0 or 1 means that it's not important at all. But if you go down, if you look at promote sustainable development, contribute to social welfare, alleviate poverty, the stakeholders of the industry, the common person, they expect Islamic finance to do this. And this is what also the Islamic economists have been talking about, that Islamic finance should be not only doing Sharia compliant banking, but also promote growth and social goals. And if you look at the views of stakeholders in terms of maximizing profit, it comes after these social goals. This is at least what the stakeholders expect, but we know that in reality, the Islamic banking has not performed well in terms of social and environmental issues. And we'll look at some pictures. But before I do that, just want to look at how the Islamic banking industry has evolved. We know that there is a lot of data information on Islamic law and financial principles. I mean, we have a rich fiqh on contract laws, among others. But I think there is a gap in terms of converting this data into knowledge which is useful and can be applied during contemporary times, and that's the gap. If you look at the approaches to innovation, we can think of two approaches. One is the easy approach, the reverse engineering. So you have an Islamic bank, he wants to come up with a product, it looks at a conventional bank and then Islamizes that product. And this is basically what's happening. The other approach is innovative engineering, which starts with the basic underlying principles of Sharia, including the Maqasid, and then try to come up with products which reflects not only the legal principles, but also the overall values. So we are talking about innovative engineering, which would produce Sharia-based solutions and products. But unfortunately, bulk of the practice has been reverse engineering. In a survey which I did with the Islamic banks on product development, I found that only 40% or 8 among 20 actually indicated that they had a structured idea generation process, which basically means that the remaining 60% didn't have any R&D to come up with products. So what can you do if you don't have an R&D, you're not investing in research to come up with products? You go to larger Islamic banks, look at conventional banks, replicate the products, and smaller Islamic banks will replicate products of larger Islamic banks. And that's what's happening in a lot of cases. And the result of this has been the evolution of Islamic banking models. The ideal model which the Islamic economists proposed was a two-tier Mudaraba model, where you'll have profit loss sharing modes on both asset side and liability side. Basically, the depositors will deposit the money on profit loss sharing, and the bank will use this funds in projects on profit loss sharing basis. Of course, that was a theory. We know that this did not happen. When Islamic banks were established, we got bankers from the conventional bank. They did not know how to manage skills in equity-based modes of financing. So what they did was, on the asset side, they started using fixed income contracts like Muraba, Ijara, and Istisna, for example. So we had moved to the second best, where we had on the liability side Mudaraba-based profit-sharing investment accounts, but on the asset side, the bulk of the assets were based on fixed income assets. But we did not stop there. It has moved to the third best model, where we have fixed income investment accounts using Tawarruk on the liability side, and also we have fixed income tools dominated by Tawarruk on the asset side. So which is basically a replication of a conventional interest-based bank. So this has been the evolution. I must say I shouldn't generalize, but in some countries at least, we see that the third best model is being used extensively. Now this is I looked at some studies, empirical work, which looked at the performance, Maqasid performance for Islamic banks. As you see, I have listed here 5 studies which are published in different academic journals. The first one looked at Sharia compliance, charitable activities, and these are the kind of things. If you look at the last conclusion, when it comes to Sharia compliance, they found, and these are basically by looking at the annual reports of different banks, and in some cases interviews, Sharia compliance is good. most of them would have Sharia because that's the nature of their business. If they don't have Sharia compliance, of course, you cannot call yourself Islamic bank. Taking care of stakeholders like employees and depositors, good to moderate. Involved in charitable activities, moderate. A lot of this is, of course, zakah money, so they distribute the zakah. And the final thing is the social and economic, environmental impact. If you look at this, it is insignificant or in some cases none. So we see that when we look at the growth in terms of quantity, the growth has been there, but in terms of quality, I think we have some questions whether it has been able to fulfill its social environmental goals. These studies show that it has not been able to do so. And because of this, we have in different academic writings criticisms of the industry. I have here quoted some from the critics who criticize the industry, and some who are actually supporters of the industry, but they also complain of some of the things happening in the industry. As you see, the first one is by Salim. Actually, Salim was an investment banker, American, based in New York. He came to Dubai, worked in an Islamic investment bank for some time, and then he went back and wrote 2 small books. The first book, the title was Islamic Banking $300 billion Deception. The industry was $300 billion then. And then you have Hamoudi, who's a law professor at one of the universities in America. He has studied Islamic practice of Islamic finance. He's used the word jurisprudential schizophrenia for what's happening in the industry. Holden talks about legal hypocrisy, and Mahmoud Al-Gamal, who's a critique of Islamic banking, calls Islamic banks rent-seeking Sharia arbiters using ruses or hila to circumvent prohibitions. And among the supporters, for example, we know that Islamic Fiqh Academy, OIC Fiqh Academy, has ruled Tawarruk to be not Sharia compliant, but still being used. And before this ruling, Professor Najatullah Siddiqui had a paper where he says that Tawarruk, the harms outweigh the benefits, and as such should not be used. Yusuf De Lorenzo, he's a Sharia scholar who sits in IOFI Sharia board. He talks about total return swap, which is used in this industry, that it is not acceptable from Sharia point of view. And we all know about Taqi Usmani, who in 2007, I think, made a statement that 85% of the partnership sukuk, the Mudaraba sukuk, were not Sharia compliant. And if you look, that was the academic writing. And this is, again, some results from, again, one of our PhD students who did a survey on Muslims living in UK. This is a perception. One here is strongly agree, and 2 is agree, and 5 is strongly disagree. And if you look at the questions are: Muslims have doubts about banking products. Muslims believe that Islamic banking is just a change of names, and Islamic financial institutions are not meeting the financial needs of Muslims. The bulk of them, of course, almost 75% plus. In all of these cases, the respondents, they believe that this is the case. So they don't see any difference between Islamic banking and commercial banking. Now, this is the perception of the average client or average Muslim. It seems that Islamic finance, in terms of its social goals, has not been able to fulfill, and this is reflected not only in academic writings but also in. Now the issue is, okay, we know that this is a problem, and we can. So what to do next? I think if we look at all the countries in the world now, we can see that at least from a new institutional perspective, at least I think Malaysia is probably one of the countries which fits in very well in terms of what we can do to support the industry. Until now, we have been basically looking at the industry in an isolated way. If you look at it from a new institutional perspective, we have to talk about the institutions, which is the legal and regulatory system. We have to talk about the organizations, which is important because the organization which Islamic banks have adopted is a debt-based, conventional interest, based financing model. And you want to do Islamic finance, equity-based modes using this model, which does not work. So let's look at the case of Malaysia, what they have done. Again, to give you a perspective, and the perspective is that in 1991, Malaysia had this Vision 2020 launched, which basically said that in 30 years' time, Malaysia wanted to become a developed country. And it identified nine challenges in order to achieve this status. Of these 9 challenges, I have chosen here 2. The 6th challenge, according to this document, was that they wanted to overcome this. The 6th challenge was establishing a scientific and progressive society, a society that is innovative, forward-looking, one that is not only a consumer of technology, but also a contributor to the scientific and technological civilization of the future. So this is a challenge which they said we have to overcome. And the 8th challenge of the 9 was ensuring an economically just society. This is a society in which there is a fair and equitable distribution of wealth of the nation, in which there is full partnership in economic progress. Actually, if you look at this challenge, and if you look at the principles of Islamic economy, I don't see any difference between this challenge, which is basically to come up with a just society and equal distribution of wealth among them. Now, what happened was, of course, this plan was implemented by different ministries, departments of the country. And the financial sector was I think the Bank Negara Malaysia, under the Ministry of Finance, took up the 10-year financial sector master plan 2000 to basically implement part of this vision. And as you see, the 10-year financial sector master plan 2000, one of their objectives was to develop a more resilient, competitive, dynamic financial system with best practices that supports and contributes positively to the growth of the economy through the economic cycle. The target in this 10-year master plan was that Islamic finance would be 20% of the total financial assets. Actually, it exceeded that target. In 2010, Islamic financial sector was 29%. And upon the expiry of this master plan, they started the financial sector blueprint 2011-20. And one of the objectives of this master plan is to advance Malaysia's thought leadership in Islamic finance. So we see thought leadership relating to the knowledge. Now, in terms of the institutional setup, the way we have defined institutions, the legal and regulatory framework, we see that Malaysia has been very active in terms of coming up with the supportive laws and regulations for the industry. The last one, Islamic Financial Services Act 2013, is a comprehensive act which actually combines all the other acts. And I think this act is actually a very powerful law to support the industry. And I'm not sure if you're aware, one of the issues in this act is the following, that if a person is found to be willfully not being Sharia compliant in a bank, the person is liable to 8 years of jail and 14 million ringgit fine. So if a person is responsible for a non-Sharia compliant business in an Islamic bank, can go to jail for 8 years or pay a fine of 14 million ringgit. So as you see that the law is very much, careful about that the banking should be Sharia compliant. Now, in terms of Sharia governance regime, they have a Central Sharia Board, which was established in 1997, and also the central bank level, Bank Negara Malaysia, has governance framework at the bank level. And of course, you have other regulatory guidelines like Sharia parameters for different contracts, product development guidelines, etc. The SEC, the Securities Exchange Commission, also had guidelines for fund management, sukuk, among others. And in terms of investment in knowledge, they have established different organizations. Some of them are for both conventional and Islamic financial sector, but 2 organizations, of course, as you see, are specifically for Islamic finance. One of them is INSIF, which was established in 2006. And again, Bank Negara Malaysia, the central bank, established a 500 million ringgit endowment to support this institution. And in 2008, they come up with this International Sharia Research Academy for Islamic Finance ISRA, again to support the industry in terms of providing the Sharia knowledge which is required. Now, I have here in terms of the education and production of knowledge. In Malaysia, you have 50 course providers and 18 universities. This is a little bit old data. Probably now you have even more, which are universities offering Islamic finance degrees. Of these, of course, INSIF is one. And I'll just give an interesting fact about how much work is being done in terms of research in the country. In the 9th International Conference on Islamic Economics and Finance 2013, which was held in Istanbul, there were 303 papers which were submitted from different parts of the world. And of these 303, 108 came from Malaysia, which is 35% plus. So more than one-third came just from Malaysia. Of these 303, 84 papers were accepted, and we have 24 papers were from Malaysia, which represents almost 29%. And you have to remember that Malaysia has a population of only 29 million, which is 1.8% of the country. So this investment in education, in the support from the government, institutional support, is we can see that we can see some results even in terms of production of knowledge. So the concluding remarks are that when you look at the economy from a new institutional economics, we see that there's a strong interplay of knowledge and economic development. And if we do not produce the knowledge, we will be a marginal adapter, meaning we will not, our institutions will become stagnant, our organizations will be not effective. And of course, the products we see will be reflecting not our values, but replications of the conventional. Now, of the 4 levels we looked at, the culture is the most important. So we need to have a culture which promotes knowledge, which actually is knowledge seeking and knowledge creating. And unless we do that, I think it will be very difficult to come up with. Now, the example of Malaysia shows that it can be done, provided there's a will and a lot of effort put to change this. Actually, if you look at new institutional economics literature, they say that culture is very slow to change. And sometimes they say that it can take centuries for cultures to change. So that is in some ways an area which we can look at. I have a final slide with 2 facts and 2 questions for you to ponder on. The first fact is, I don't know how many of you know that the first printing press was a German. I think he basically came up with the first printing press in 1450. But during that time, the Ottoman Empire, the Mufti there, he gave a fatwa that using printing press is haram, mainly because in printing press you had to, during that time, manually put the letters, and they which could probably create some mistakes. So because by using a printing press, there could be mistakes in the Quran, he gave a fatwa that printing press was haram. And what happened was this prohibition was there for 300 years. And I think one of the key things about the printing press was that the nature of education and knowledge in societies changed dramatically. Just think, before a printing press, if you wanted to read a book, it was handwritten. So the dissemination of knowledge was very, very limited. The printing press, what it did was it made knowledge available to masses of people through the printing press. And the Muslims were deprived of this for 300 years. And I personally feel that probably this fatwa is one of the most costly fatwas, which is responsible for the the lack of knowledge development in Muslim world. The second fact is more recent, and again this is taken from Arab Human Development Report. In 5 years in the 1980s, the average books which were translated into Arabic is 4.4 books per million inhabitants. And the same number for Hungary, one country, is 519, and for Spain it was 920 per million. So these are unfortunately the depressing facts. And the questions I pose with you, and I'll not answer, just for you to ponder on, is the culture which the Muslim world has adopted an impediment to knowledge creation and development. And maybe I'll quote Dr. Abdul Wahab Abu Suleiman. He came to actually IRTI when I was here, and he gave a very interesting talk on culture and development. And he started his lecture by asking this question. He said that if you look at the Muslim world from east to west, north to south, you'll see that everything is different except two things. Like if you look at their clothes they wear, their eating habits, language, everything is different. The two things common is that one is Islam, the other is underdevelopment. And then he asked the question that what is this quote unquote culture we have adopted which is creating this underdevelopment? And the second question I have is that we know that the Millennium Development Goals will expire this year, and the United Nations along with World Bank is going to launch the Sustainable Development Goals. What is Islamic finance going to contribute to achieving this Sustainable Development Goals? I hope it will have a positive role, but we'll have to wait and see. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor Habib, for your informative presentation. Now we open the floor for any question or comments.
Thank you for enlightening lecture. This actually reminds us how many years back when you were here. Thank you very much. And we are delighted to have you back, and I hope you come back also. Want to come back?
I'm here.
It's always good to come back home.
Yeah.
But see, I have two things first. The first thing, you can also help me and guide me. I really find it difficult actually in connecting the first part of the picture to the second one. Even though you highlighted Malaysia case as a knowledge, quote unquote knowledge economy. But I just find the disconnect between Islamic finance and this idea of knowledge actually.
Okay.
The second thing about the last question that you asked about how can the Islamic finance help in the SDGs. Well, actually, I think the question should be back to you. What did the Islamic finance have done to the MDGs? The same thing, and I don't think I think if we are thinking that the Islamic finance can do much, I think we are deceiving ourselves or we are not really realistic. Because these goals actually are, and I think it's not one country or one nation, or I think it's a global effort. And I think economic finance, if you put it global-wise, I think how much it is from the total financial, say, sector, very small. So I think its contribution remains small. But how can Islamic finance, I would say, help the member countries, say, or IDB member countries, or what can IDB do, I would say, rather than Islamic finance, to help member countries into the SDGs? Because I think if Islamic finance cannot contribute much to the MDGs, I don't think they can contribute much also to it. So, thank you again, and always good to have you back.
Can I respond to him? Okay, I think to respond to your first question, I didn't have the time to, I think I was going over anyway, right?
Nice.
I'll show you, I'll just explain you using the figure. What has happened with Islamic finance is that we have, Islamic finance has evolved in a marginal adaptation mode. What has happened is there was a demand for Sharia compliant financing due to obvious reasons. Muslims, due to their religious convictions, do not want to engage with the conventional interest-based financing. And the industry responded by coming up with this, with the product. So we know that Dubai Islamic Bank was established. Now, so we're talking about the organization, this Islamic Bank established. Now, the question I have is that the banking model which Islamic banks have adopted, does it reflect the values of Sharia? As I said, the ideal model was a two-tier Mudaraba model. And because we have not invested in knowledge in terms of what is the organizational format, through which we can adopt this two-tier Mudaraba model, we adopted a Western interest-based model, which is debt-based, And then what happened is the evolution of Islamic banking to the third best is basically because the organizational structure which adopted was a wrong structure. So this is at the organization level. At the institution level, a lot of things, I think a lot of Islamic banks operate under laws and regulations which are not supportive of Islamic finance. And we're not talking only about banking laws. A lot of countries don't have banking laws, so you cannot have even Islamic banks in those countries. If some countries have Islamic banks, their tax laws are against Islamic finance. They have not changed their tax laws, for example. So I think what has happened in Islamic finance is that instead of changing institutions and coming up with appropriate organizations which reflect the values and principles of Sharia, we have just started at the transaction level. We wanted Islamic banking. We used a Western model which does not actually reflect the values, and then our institutions have not changed to accommodate this Islamic finance because it's very different. So the example of Malaysia shows that they have changed their laws. They're trying to build the knowledge in terms of organizations, and also actually, for example, one of the good examples in Pakistan, Mudaraba companies. This is a unique Islamic institution and probably reflects more the principles of Islamic finance than a conventional bank. So we probably ideal Islamic financial institution would be less banks and more non-bank financial institutions in terms of Mudaraba model, venture capital, for example, cooperatives and things like that. As for your second question, this is what we hear that what can Islamic finance do? In some countries, Islamic finance is becoming a very significant part of the financial sector. In Saudi Arabia, the last I saw it is almost 50% of the financial, and as time will pass, it will become more significant. Now, if you look at what is happening in the West, a lot of Western institutions are actually talking about these issues. Responsible investment, responsible financing. And if you look at the numbers actually, and a lot of it is partly driven by the consumers, by the way, because there's ethical investment, people want these things. And I don't remember the numbers, but the numbers are actually huge. Now, the issue is that if the West can do it, for Islamic finance is not something that you choose to do it, but it should be an integral part of the operations, right? And I think what is happening is we see that this is lacking. And in Sustainable Development Goals, one of the key issues relates to poverty. And if we're talking about Islamic finance and it cannot solve it cannot support alleviation of poverty, not through banks, through non-bank financial institutions, then we have a problem. And I think we have to highlight this, and it is because it is part of the quote unquote the values of Maqasid, which is missing in the practice.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, I very much appreciate the way you included the culture element in all this system. Of course, we will focus on the Islamic finance, but your approach is very profound because it tried to reach the grassroots of the problem. And I will start by the culture. I have seen your slide on the definitions you could pick. None of them was carrying the spiritual element. And I still remember a conference I attended at my university, early 80s, when I still remember the scholar was reporting how for the first time in 1982 in Mexico summit, the culture was defined in a new way, and basically reporting the fact that it's a complex accumulation of many elements. The first one should be the spiritual feature, in addition to the material feature. I will start from this, and probably you may include this definition because it will guide all your analysis. This failure you are identifying in achieving some kind of expectation, in my opinion, starts from this. In our culture, in our Islamic society or Muslim countries, that's exactly the problem. We do have a culture, but is it the right culture in line with our religion? So the lack of spiritual element and feature is one of the most important issues. Of course, closing jihad was one of the very oldest problems, and some scholars are even considering that's exactly when our decline has contributed to the human civilization started. And you gave the right example of prohibiting the printing press only because there is a problem or an issue or a possible problem to make mistakes in Quran. Printing press was completely forbidden, and this created a lot of lack of knowledge. So on and so forth, but the East-West kind of inferiority complex, the civilization. So finally, what do you think? Are you still following the same qualification or measurement or a system which is more material based, or shall we include also, if I refer to the survey you referred to also, these questions are still mainly oriented to the quantifiable material deliveries. Islamic finance could be something completely in contradiction with the classic economy, you know. When you make sadaqah, you are reducing from your income, but you feel a very high level of utility. While in classical economy, of course, it's exactly the opposite. It should give a negative utility, it should reduce utility. So we should not stand in the same basis. Also regarding your assessment of the Islamic banking, because Islamic finance is larger. I do agree with many researchers who are considering that we are still in the first stage of the no riba bank. How to do the same banking business without riba. So a very little feather showing that you are not really following riba is enough. But is this Islamic banking? Of course, this is not. Even in very high organization, when there are certain trials to put up certain mudaraba-based financing, you will find the institution deciders insisting on guarantees because the cultural feature is more than the spiritual feature. Even the definition of money and wealth, we don't remember enough that wealth and money is of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and we are just mustakhlifin in the standard wealth. And the istikhlaf requires 1, 2, 3, 4. So I think that's where the problem is coming. I will not take more time also in the institutional and organizational element. The question is, who should lead? Who should lead? The political will is there in Malaysia. Unfortunately, it doesn't take place in other Islamic countries. I will be very transparent with you. The standard setting bodies of the Islamic finance now, who are the decision makers? Who are the decision makers? These are governors of conventionally oriented central banks, for the majority of them. So whenever there is an issue of Islamic finance rationale, but probably creating certain issue in the conventional finance regulation, they will not accept it, even if it is very well founded in Islamic finance. Thank you very much.
Well, there are a lot of issues you raised.
In general.
I'll just say the first part you mentioned about culture. I think I agree with you that spiritual issue is definitely a part of culture. And here, if you remember this, I said it can be viewed at 3 levels. The core is about spiritual, right? Beliefs and assumptions of human existence. This is the heart of the issue. I mean, what is the worldview of existence itself? And of course, if you are a believer, and Muslims, non-Muslim, I mean, even other believers, your worldview will be very different than a lot of atheists who don't have this. And of course, then within the believers, you have Muslims who will have a different So I think these are definitely very important things, and values and norms derived from this core belief. Now the issue is, of course, when you talk about economic development and Islamic finance, we're focusing more on the economics part in the discussion. But I think one of the beauties of this new institutional economics is at least they acknowledge this. And I personally feel that Islamic economics probably can be discussed in a better way using this framework rather than the neoclassical framework, because at least you can bring in culture, religion within this framework. Anyway, you had a lot of questions. Maybe you can. Yes, no.
I don't have that many diamond questions. First of all, thank you very much for the very nice presentation. And as you mentioned that for any good financial system, we have to have the institutional framework and the organization, the organizational structures to support it. What we see now in Islamic finance, you gave the example of Malaysia. Unfortunately, the will is there, the model is there, but what we see in terms of the compliance to Sharia, that is a bigger challenge. See, the thing is, as you have mentioned in a survey that your students have done for England, a similar survey has been done in Pakistan recently. The problem is, majority of the Muslim population do not believe that the kind of financial system that we are bringing is Islamic financial system. So whether we can add anything to sustainable development goal or millennium development goal, this would be the second step. The first step, if we believe it is Islamic finance system, we work on it, we develop the knowledge to grow it. But before that, the organizational structure is not there, the institutional framework is not there. So what do you think that what we can do in that respect?
Well, I think you raise important issues and not easy, I mean, the complex issues. First, I'll talk about, a lot of the surveys taken, in some ways it also reflects the lack of knowledge among quote-unquote people, the cultural part. Some of the apprehensions which people have is right, but a lot of it is because they don't understand. So if a bank is doing murabaha properly, I don't have any problems with that. But even for a person who is not, he looks at a murabaha and he says, what's the difference between a murabaha and a bank loan? Of course, there are differences. Now, this is the knowledge problem in the culture itself. That we, in our schools, in Pakistan, I don't know if they do it still. When you are doing your math, they teach you compound interest as practice and things like that. This is what we are taught. We are not taught what is a murabaha and istisna and things like that, right? So I think the knowledge problem, what you point out, is partly knowledge problem in the culture itself, that we don't understand our own literature in terms of what is the Islamic contracts and things like that. Now, in terms of what you mentioned, Malaysia, of course, I am aware that in Malaysia, some of the products they use are quote-unquote not acceptable in GCC. But given the institutional support, if you look at the direction, the future, I see Islamic finance in much better shape in Malaysia than in the Gulf. Because of this, in the Gulf, what is happening is Islamic finance left to the markets, and the market determines what is coming in and what's going to happen. So this third best in terms of because of the market-driven forces. I'm not sure if you're aware, recently, in Malaysia, they allow Bail-Ina, but a lot of banks are moving away from Bail-Ina, they're moving to Tawarruk. The direction is good, not that Tawarruk is a better product, but probably better than Bail-Ina. But I'm talking about the direction of the industry is in the right way. It's not the other way. And I personally know that I think Malaysian, when you talk to some people and some very senior people, they are now talking about these issues, that Islamic banking is more than just Sharia compliant, quote unquote, financing. The main issue is because of the institutional support and the framework, I see Islamic finance in much better shape in Malaysia than where you don't have that. Yes. Welcome, sir.
Thank you very much for your talk. You spoke about the growth of the Islamic finance industry, which is remarkable, but you also talked about the quality
In your opinion, what are the major challenges to this quality, and how can we really improve this quality?
Well, I think I think the answer is not easy. The issue is I think when you talk about Islamic finance, one of the key problem is we had the basic principles. We have not invested in the knowledge which would give us this alternative. When I look at the principles of Islamic finance, I personally feel that a cooperative model is much quote unquote Islamic than a banking model. And actually, in Malaysia, in southern Thailand, they have because there was no banking law, and because the majority of the Muslims in the south people in the south were Muslims, they created these cooperatives, which almost does everything like a bank, but they're cooperatives. The profit they make is distributed among the members, and I think the nature of that organization is definitely better suited to Islamic values than a bank. So key is to invest in knowledge which can produce the right organizational formats and also the right products. Now there is an issue about institutions. Institutions is a political will issue. There it is a question of political will. Malaysia has the political will. It is changing laws, supporting the industry. That is something which relates to politics and is very difficult to say what the political will decide in terms of establishing the institutions. So I think I didn't give a very good answer because the answer is not easy. But the key issue from what we know is that we need to produce the right knowledge to create these institutions, to create the organizations and the products. And it's not an easy job, by the way. I mean, if I just, I don't know if you have time. I just want to.
We have time.
I just want to give you an example. Waqf is a very, institution which, or a thing which the Muslim world has used a lot. If you look at some studies, they say that the trust in the Western legal system, the English legal system, came from the concept of Waqf. Then they developed this trust and has so many uses. Now, when you create a sukuk, you have to create a SPV, and it is usually a trust. Now, why can't what we have done with Waqf? We've left it there, it has stagnated, and we have not used it. So this is the question of how you can evolve this concept for contemporary times. I personally don't find any problems of using quote unquote a Waqf in a sukuk structure from a Sharia point of view. Because the Waqf is, there's nothing in the Nas, in the Sharia, Quran and Sunnah. So it's flexible. And actually in 2009, OIC Fiqh Academy came up with a very resolution which made it very flexible. You can create even temporary Waqf. So this is an example of when you use knowledge and can convert things and which can be used. So you're issuing an Islamic instrument sukuk and you're using a trust, but you cannot use a Waqf because we have not developed the concept of Waqf to be used in that way. Okay.
This question: do you agree that allocation of resources is a political decision, not a cultural decision?
No, I didn't say it's a cultural decision. I said that the demand for goods is reflective of the culture. What actually, there's an Italian philosopher I read a long time back. He said that to produce something for production, you need efficiency. To consume, you need culture. So basically, culture tells what people will consume. So if in a society people want to read a lot, you'll see a lot of bookstores in the malls, right? So that is the reflective, because so culture is part of the market. So allocation of resources, part of it comes from the suppliers, part of it comes from the culture. So the demand for whatever. So if in a society people want to have some certain kind of clothes, the market will supply it. So the culture determines only one part of the market, the demand side. So allocation of resources, of course, is supply and demand together, and culture determines the demand side, the preferences.
I would like to thank you again, Professor Habib, and I would like to thank you all, and hope to see you again, inshallah, in our next event. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
وعليكم السلام. شكرا.
كيف يقدر يشوف